Hi, everyone. This is Mystery Monday, and I'm author and writing coach Zara Altair. Today, we're going to talk about one of the biggest problems for writers in their story, and that is the sagging middle. So, we're going to look at some ways to keep your mystery lively, keep your detective challenged, and increase the tension as you go along from the midpoint of the story. So I like to think of it as the detective actually going into the killer's world. He finds the killer's world. All up to the midpoint, the detective has been going into the victim's world. And somewhere in that victim's world is the killer. And as we go into the second half of your story, we start to get glimpses of the killer's world. That we haven't really identified the killer yet, but the detective is getting closer. And one of the things that happens in this part is that the killer starts to get anxious. He sees the detective getting closer. Even if the detective doesn't see that, the killer sees it. So I actually think that mystery writers have an advantage over many other genres when it comes to keeping the middle from sagging. Because up to the middle, the detective has delved into the evidence and suspects in the victim's world. The essence of keeping a reader turning pages is heightened tension. And rather than episodic scenes where this happens and then that happens and something else happens, you create a tension by throwing up increasing, baffling obstacles for your detective. And they can come from any direction. They can come from his opponent. They can come from love interest if you have a love interest. And they can come from suspects. So in the chapters directly after the crisis in the middle, your detective starts getting glimpses of the killer's world. And these glimpses into the killer's world are the mystery writer's advantage. I think we really have an advantage here, is that we just keep going deeper. We go from the victim's world to glimpses of the killer's world, because the detective enters a world within a world. So, when he starts out, he's literally clueless. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know anything about the victim. He doesn't know anything about the victim's world, and he certainly doesn't know anything about the killer. But here's where you start to disclose little clues that point your detector toward the killer. And as in these chapters, the detective gets glimpses of the intersection between those two worlds, between the victim's world and the killer's world. So I think we have a great advantage here in keeping that middle from sagging and making it feel episodic. So let's go through with Bonnie Johnston's 40 sentences. I just want to make clear that, 40 sentences doesn't mean 40 chapters. It's nothing, as always in writing, nothing is carved in stone. But I think if you touch on these 40 points in your story, you're going to have a really solid story at the end. And that's what it's all about when you're writing a novel, including a mystery novel. So here we go. Here's what Bonnie says. Remember, in the midpoint, your detective has had a big crisis. So now in the next chapter, he might feel foolish for not seeing things clearly until now. But your protagonist makes a new plan. Unfortunately, now that he's past the meltdown, he fails to recognize that temporarily abandoning his misbelief was a healthy thing, and he grabs onto that misbelief more tightly. So let's narrow that down to your detective. Your detective, stumped by recent events, tries going back to old interpretations. She reviews what suspects said, considers the victim's world, and pokes around in it, completely missing the key elements. She's regrouping, but she sees nothing new. She just missed that opportunity to look at everything in a new way. So, if you're used to traditional story structure labels, this is the aftermath of the midpoint. All right, and then the next chapter is executing the new plan while gathering allies and resources as he goes. Your protagonist hits a snag, and it becomes apparent that his epiphany might have made him a wee bit overconfident. And also, here's where you can have an episode from your subplot B. So, our subplot B is the opponent. So, the opponent throws up a roadblock as your detective goes out to find new resources, histories of the victim, and new knowledge of the victim's world. His great idea is not getting him closer to finding the antagonist. And so in story structure, this is the fourth complication. So the complication can come from an opponent, it can come from the love interest, it can come from a suspect, including the killer, because he doesn't know who the killer is yet. All right. And then the next chapter, he must improvise once again in the face of a dilemma, and his misbelief wants him to choose option 1, but his epiphany suggests option 2 as the way to go. And also here is another point where you can include your subplot. We're doing subplot A in our mythical story, and that is the person of the opposite sex. So your detective is out of the victim's world, and he makes a stab at connecting with suspect. But an inspiration suggests he get background on the suspects and how they operate in the victim's world. And things get intense with the love interest, and they may say or do something that gives your detective new insight. So your love interest may not be talking about the mystery, but they may say something that triggers something in your detective's mind. So you see how you can interweave your main story and the subplot. So in the plot world, that fourth complication threw your detective for a loop, and this is the aftermath. He's just kind of recovering and thinking about thinking in a new way. All right, and on the next chapter, whether he makes the wrong choice or fumbles after making the right choice, he's now on a collision course with the antagonist. He might be walking into an ambush, or he might be deliberately seeking the confrontation without realizing how seriously he's outgunned. All right, for your detective, although he doesn't know it yet, your detective's new vision of the victim's world sets him in direct opposition to the killer. And feeling pinched, the killer may strike another victim, or strike out undercover at the detective himself. And the detective thinks the two murders are related but doesn't see how. So in the story structure, this is the setup for the second pinch point. So I hope you're seeing how this keeps us from that middle sagging thing where there's one thing and then there's another, but there's no building of tension. In this part of your mystery, you can really pull out all your guns and make things as complicated as you want for your detective. Just really give him stuff to chew on and problems and people not cooperating. All right. So in this fifth chapter, after the middle, the antagonist has the upper hand, and your protagonist feels his enemy's true power, and the antagonist is even stronger than before. Your protagonist might get a glimpse into the enemy's endgame, but he definitely realizes how deeply he's in over his head, and this is another place for a twist. So if we focus down on the detective's world turns topsy-turvy. Perhaps a seeming ally suddenly becomes antagonistic, or a reluctant suspect shares new information. But without knowing it, the detective is getting close to the killer, and the killer knows it and now plans ways to stop your detective. So here's a place to make the complications complicated. Just really lay it on your detective. Nothing is working. So in plot structure, this is the second pinch point, and my advice is make it hurt. Okay. All right. So those are the next 5 chapters after the midpoint of your story, and they're focused on frustrations, complications, and weaknesses. So one thing I would suggest is, just as you highlight your detective's strengths at the beginning, highlight his weaknesses as you leave the middle. You don't have to make these weaknesses glaring, but you can definitely cause trouble for your detective. So for example, take your detective's strength as far as it can go until it becomes a hindrance. So if your detective is always confident, take it to overconfidence so he misses an important detail. And here's also a place where you can plant new clues to the killer's identity and get suspects, especially the killer, to misdirect your detective and allow your detective to actively look in the wrong places while the killer starts to feel the threat. The detective's poking around, and the killer is feels that detective getting close, and so they start making moves against your detective. So in this section, you really want to make your detective work hard for every piece of information. See, because the aim in this section of your story is to make things as difficult for your detective as possible. The closer he gets to the killer, the more things get in his way. The detective finds the killer's world, but he hasn't found the killer yet. In other words, he hasn't really identified who it is. He gets glimpses, but he hasn't really identified him yet. Okay, I hope that helps. And if you have any questions about this part or want to know more about keeping that middle from sagging, be sure to get in touch with me. You can get in touch with me on Facebook or at my email at Zara@zaraaltair.com. This is such an important part of your story, and you can just really throw things at your detective and keep him frustrated. All right. So, questions and answers. First question. Okay, what is a character Bible? I've heard you mention it and I don't understand. Yeah, I know. It's something that's kind of come into the writer's world from the screenwriting world, but it's actually the place where you keep all the background notes for all the characters in your novel. You want to have each character in your novel down to the most insignificant. You want to have them in that character Bible, and you want to know as much as you can about those characters. So the material is going to be really extensive for your detective, the victim, and the killer. And you want to know about the suspects and the opponent in order for them to raise obstacles in believable ways. So the more you kind of delve into the background of those characters, the better able you are to throw up those challenges, just like we mentioned in this section right after the middle of the story. So essentially, just the short answer is the character Bible is the place where you keep all of the information in one place. Some writers use a binder and they have a page or pages for each character with tabs in the binder for each character. Some people use software. Some people set it up in documents like Word or Google Docs. Or I just met someone recently who uses Google Keep for all his characters. So, but it's the place where you keep all your character information. I hope that answered your question and clarified it. I know it's terminology. Anyway, okay, next question. Let's see. I know I'm the oddball out, but I can't get away from grammar rules. So, yeah, well, they're important, so it's good that you pay attention to them. So, my beta readers tell me my dialogue is stiff. Any tips? Yeah, it's the one place, dialogue is the one place where you get to break, and you should break, grammar rules. It just doesn't ring true. People, if you listen to people speak, you'll notice that they don't speak always in complete sentences, or they speak in run-on sentences, and they certainly don't use any kind of formal construction. Very, very unusual for somebody to do that. So they use sentence fragments as thoughts, as they have thoughts pop into their head. They may just have a fragment. And I know for grammar freaks that really sounds scary, but it's how real people talk. They stream out thoughts that are not always grammatically correct. So if you're struggling with your dialogue, it really helps to go listen to people talk. We actually did an episode a while back about this, but just go out to a cafe and listen to conversation and take notes and get a feel for the rhythm of natural speech, how it flows. Where do people pause, and why do they pause, and what do they just blurt out? And what do they say after they deliberated and thought about something? All of those things are going to have a different rhythm, and you want to reflect those rhythms in your dialogue in the story, and use varieties of speech. I've also found, especially for beginning writers, that it helps in that character Bible we were talking about a little earlier. If you give some speech patterns or um, phrases that a character repeats, um, to help you and to help readers identify with that character. Um, but I wrote an article about this quite a while back. It was called Characters Don't Speak in Semicolons. And I will place a link to that article in the show notes. All right, that was a really good question. And then I just wanted to add another thing I had. I sent my current story out to the beta readers, and one of my beta readers tried to correct all the grammar in the dialogue, and it just doesn't work. It made them all sound stilted, and so you have to know as a writer and as a novelist, you have to know that you kind of put the grammar rules aside when you're writing dialogue, and to trust that once you get a feel for it. Thank you. That was a very good question, and I hope that helped. So I want to thank people for the questions they submitted, and remember, writers, don't be shy. There are no dumb questions, because your questions are an opportunity to refine your writing skills. So be sure to send me your questions, and I'll answer them here on Mystery Monday. And just as I just mentioned, my next story, The Vellum Scribe, an Argolicus mystery, is out to beta readers, and I am getting some great feedback. So look for the release of The Vellum Scribe on September 1st. I want to thank everybody for listening, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And don't forget, send me your questions. Okay, I will see you next week.